And that's what she said, you know, well, what did you feel? She'd write in there, what did you feel? Tell us, what, you know, how you were. So, you know, that improved it, I would say, greatly. It wasn't easy for me, but it improved it greatly. There were nights I woke up 2, 3 o'clock in the morning and I'm thinking about the book, and all of a sudden I've got to write that down. I'm writing stuff down, you know, but that's the way it developed.
Yeah. Did you even remember you had those letters, or?
No, I didn't know. I didn't know that my mother had saved them, and I didn't know my mother had since passed away, and I didn't know. In fact, my wife said she was going to throw them away, but thought maybe she'd hang on to them, which I'm glad she did. No, I didn't know that they still had the letters.
And you had audio too, it seemed, or is that?
Yes, we would exchange little cassette tapes, and I would talk, you know, on a tape and whatever, because I got like a little portable recorder I bought off a Navy supply ship, and mail them home, and they would record stuff and mail it to me, you know. And then, you know, like there'd be a family gathering, so everybody in the family would chip in something, say hi and whatever, and tell you what they're doing in their life. My dad was a big fan of the show Hee Haw years ago, kind of a slapstick country thing, and he loved that show, and he'd record that and send it to me.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. What were some of the most surprising moments that you had reading through your letters and listening to the audio that you sent?
Perhaps the depth of some of what I shared of my thoughts, my thinking. Well, you know what? There's one that might, I'll read something out of my book that might sort of give you an idea. This is toward the end of my service, and I'm writing home. I know I'm going to be home soon.
Mm-hmm.
And I say, it'll be great to sleep in a clean, fresh bed and shower whenever I feel like it, and have clean clothes that fit right, and be sure of being able to get a good home-cooked meal, and be my own boss and not have to worry about a boat before all other things. I don't think anyone will ever know what this year has been like. Some will think it was much worse than it really was, and others will realize that it wasn't that good either. No one will ever know, but I don't really expect them to. Parts of it were bad and parts of it were good. I've had hundreds of buddies and friends, but even more important, I think the year has done a lot to improve my character and awareness of the world we live in. It's made me more independent and self-confident than I've ever been. This is the final proving ground of manhood, I think. I think in time I'll come to be glad I spent a year over here. It gave me time to do a lot of thinking about a lot of things, and it forced me out of my blind little self-centered world I resided in.
Wow. Yeah, it's very insightful.
Yeah, so there's some of those things. I mean, there were things like I was aware that we had gone into Cambodia in April of 1970 before it ever hit the news over here.
Mm-hmm.
Started writing the book, I saw what I wrote in a letter, and I saw what the news headlines were when you went online and did research. I was like, well, I knew about that a day or two before it happened. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Was it anything like what you had expected it would be like? You remember, like, do you remember, I guess, when you were your initial experiences in Vietnam?
I never expected to be on a swift boat. I didn't even know what a swift boat was.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know what the Brown Water Navy was. I joined the Navy in order to try to stay out of Vietnam and stay out of combat. And when I got my orders, I didn't even know what they were. They had to explain to me what a PCF was. Like, what's a PCF? Well, that's a patrol craft fast. That's a boat. And why am I going to California? Well, because they're going to teach you how to be on this boat before they send you to Vietnam. I said, Vietnam? I can't go to Vietnam.
Yeah.
That was for health reasons for my parents. That was why I said that. But so, you know, the 10 weeks of training were terrific. Fantastic job of preparing us. You know, initially, swift boats were sent over to do coastal patrols in 1965. Mm-hmm. By the time I went over there, I went over in fall of '69. majority of the swift boats were in the rivers and canals. And it was a whole different, what you were doing was extremely different than the coastal patrol and was far more dangerous. It was, it was more close combat and that type of thing. So, when I got there, they trained us for both in that 10-week period. So it wasn't like it was a big shock that, oh, we're not going to be on the coast. We're going to be, pretty much know it, and there's a shock to another culture. And they had advised us and trained us. Vietnamese people have a different culture than you have. They're going to do things differently. There'll be habits they have that you're not used to. So you're going to have cultural shock, and there is a little bit of cultural shock, and eventually you get to it. The most of where I operated was in extremely rural areas in the Delta. Now, I did on different occasions in transit be in Saigon for a few days, and that's a whole different city that's just bubbling over with population and people. And it's an experience. Just being on the street in Saigon is an experience that there's like every kind of vehicle on earth. There's motorcycles and motorbikes and bikes and Jeeps and cars. And there doesn't seem to be any rules about who's on what side of the road,
Yeah.
So I've seen the cities, and I've seen, like, Vung Tau is a nice French resort. So one of our bases was near Vung Tau, and I went there. It was a different, smaller kind of town. I've seen the little bitty villages in the Delta. But I've also, you can see from my pictures, been in areas where there's huts. There's a hut here and a hut there, and places where there's nothing because the enemy controls it and nobody's going to be there. So seen all those places.
Yeah. You mentioned that you had good training,
Yes.
and you go at length into your book about your training. And for me, it was quite shocking. I had never read about boot camp in the way you had written it. Could you share some of your, I guess, experiences and how it felt reliving some of that for the book?
Well, yeah, you referenced boot camp, and boot camp is pretty much routine for everybody. But training for, the advanced training to go to be a swift boat, that was another whole nother experience. Probably, well, first off, it's a 6-man crew and everybody's cross-trained. So I was an engineman, but everybody had to know something about pumps and engines and so forth. We had radar, we had radios. You had to know about all that stuff. You had to be able to code messages and decode messages. Tremendous amount of first aid. We had 2-week crash course in Vietnamese language, which gave us the ability to tell somebody to stop, come here and show me your ID and where's the enemy. It's about, and we could count to 10. We had a week of survival training, which was very extensive. A lot of this training was done by Navy SEALs. And we had a week of survival school. The acronym for that is SEER, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. So we spent 5 or 6 days in the woods in Puget Sound, basically living on the ground and learning about survival. And all day long there'd be lectures, and then at the end of the day they'd send you out to try to find something to eat in the woods, with berries or this or that. We got pretty hungry, and at the end of it, they put you to a obstacle course, not an obstacle course, like an evasion course where you're supposed to find your way with a compass, and learn how to find your way with a compass. And then at the end, you're given an evasion course, and there are trainers who are dressed and talking like Vietnamese, and they're trying to capture you, you're trying to hide, and eventually, if you're not captured, you get an apple or an orange or something, but everybody has to go to the POW camp and be trained how to survive as a POW. And that was brutal training. Today, I think most people knew what we went through. They'd say, there should be a lawsuit, or you can't do that to people. But it was very tough training, but it taught us. Taught me I'm going to do my best to never get captured. I'll make them kill me before I get captured, because I'm not going to be in that situation and be tortured. We tasted torture of certain types, water tortures and that sort of thing. And people could say, well, that's awful. Well, You know what you learn? We get beat once in a while, you know? You learn you can survive. It's not the end of the world. You can get through these things. And at the same time, they were testing us to see whether we could hack it, you know, whether we were gonna fit into being able to do the role they were putting us into. I have no complaints about it. It was tough, but I have no complaints.
Mhm. And when you were finally there in Vietnam, like how you had mentioned to me, we had a conversation earlier this week, and you had mentioned to me there were things that you felt you were prepared for, and other things, of course, you can't prepare for. Um, when you're there, I mean, what was it like? I guess being trained versus okay, now I'm here.
Oh, well, you know, one of the things you heard quite often when you got over it was, well, in school, they told you it's going to be, you're going to do it this way, but over here, this is how we do it because this is what we found out works. And I think probably a lot of branches of the military, your job, you find out that there's the textbook way to do it, but then under certain circumstances, you don't do it the textbook way because we found it. I'll give you an example. We were taught that if we were fired upon, that we were to return fire and clear the kill zone, get out of there, and then turn around and make firing runs back and forth until you suppress the enemy fire. When we got over there, the enemy had figured this out, that this is our routine, so they had like double and triple ambushes set up. So you had to change. So they said, okay, we're not going to do it that way. The next step was you clear the kill zone and you get out of their range and you mortar them because we had an 81 millimeter, and you call in air support and you mortar the area. And then they said, well, that's, maybe that's not the thing to do. So they kept changing so the enemy didn't know what to expect our moves would be. Whereas in training, it was just one move, but as you go through these experiences, you learn that you can't always do it this way or that way, depending on every, as you mentioned earlier, that part in there, every part of the country is different. The operating areas were different. The task was different. So you didn't always do the same thing. You had, when you got to an area, you learned how they do it there, and that's how you did it. Because we got shuffled around. We would be deployed from our base, from our division headquarters, for anywhere from 2 weeks to a month. And while we were deployed, we would be based off of a forward operating base, sometimes just a floating barge, barges with supplies and stuff. So you might get back to your division headquarters where you can get, sleep on a rack in a bed and get a regular shower and regular chow all night, whereas the rest of the time we were catch as catch can kind of existence as far as food and bathing and, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, you go at length, Charlie, into your crewmates and your relationship with your crewmates. And at one point you talk about how you get to a point with your crew that you no longer are just 7 men, but you are now working together and you're like a unit.
The boat and the men
yeah,
are
yeah.
that boat is our home 90% of the time. So, and the boat and the men sort of almost operate together. It's like you're unified somehow,
Yeah. Could you elaborate on how you got there with your crew, and do you still keep in touch with many of them? And
well,
yeah,
if you live 24 hours a day with people, you eat with them and you sleep and you do your operations with them, and there's down times when you talk about what you did at home and your girlfriend or your home or your family and so forth. You get to know people. And, there's even people that sometimes you're not too crazy about their personality. You find out in the heat of things, you can count on them and your attitude towards them gets much better.
Yeah. You went through several different officers, and there was a particular officer that you really respected, but then I think
Yes.
you went through phases where you had an officer that you didn't quite, your opinion didn't quite align with his, and,
So
you
my
know,
first officer
yeah.
was Lieutenant Jack Burke,
Mhm.
and I have been in touch with him. He stopped in and visited me a few months back, him and his wife. We had a nice visit. I respected him. He was every bit an officer. He did what he was told he had to do, but he did it in the safest way possible for his men. And that was terrific. When he was replaced, we had an officer whose nickname was Wild Bill Keene. And he was wild. And he did things really not in the book, let's say, that were dangerous and risky. He earned a very notorious reputation for his escapades, but I was not happy with that.
I bet.
We had another officer late in my service that I don't know, he kind of acted very privileged, like we had to let him know that everybody washes their own dishes here. Everybody cleans their own mess up.
Yeah.
We don't clean up after you. Pick your clothes up, put them away, that type of thing. Because at 50-foot boat and 6 guys, you've got to take care of everything. And we're not waiting on you. You may be the officer, but we're not waiting on you. You're one of the crew.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a question from an anonymous attendee, and the question is, what percentage of the GIs believed in the mission of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, or did they reluctantly accept their fate being a draftee or enlisted?
Well, that would be hard for anybody to know the
Yeah.
on that. I really can't tell you what the percentages are. I just know that some guys thought this is a total waste, and there are other guys who realized what we were trying to accomplish and were very much sympathetic to the plight of the Vietnamese and respectful of them. But there was a large number who just got stuck here. They didn't want to do this. But I've seen statistics of how many men volunteered and how many people were sent there and drafted, and you'd be amazed at the number of volunteers. You'd be amazed at the number of guys who went back for a second or third term. And in some cases, like on the riverboats that I was on, guys that were actually in combat that signed up for second and third terms and went back again. So, but I can't tell you a percentage.
Yeah. Thank you, Charlie.
Yeah.
I know that you in your book describe a fateful night where you encountered combat, and it was very dangerous, and you're lucky to be here. And it was interesting because in your book, when you described that night, you actually reached out to some of your crewmates and asked for their perspectives. Could you tell us more about, I guess, in hindsight, how has that affected you, I guess? And was it a turning point for you? Was it, I think in your book, you talk about how it changed you.
Okay. It changed me years later.
Oh.
When I could process what happened. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think combat initially changes everybody a little bit, but yes, okay. So it was January the 13th of 1970. We had this new boat officer that we'd never operated with before. We were sent to a place called Ha Tien, which was at the mouth of the Ginthang River, which is at the top of the Gulf of Thailand, once called the Gulf of Siam. We were assigned 4-night ambushes in a row. So now you're sending us out there with a new officer into a place we'd never been in daylight and sending us to the worst part of it. We up the river and into a tiny canal, which was notorious for enemy contact. So we're on our 4th night on an ambush in this canal. There's boats. By the way, these ambushes were every 1,000 yards of this river and canal, a block, because it ran right next to the Cambodian border. So it was an entry point all along there for the enemy to bring in supplies and weapons and men and so forth. So that was basically a river and a canal blockade. So it was raining that night. We had what was called sound-powered phones on so that we could talk with one another without being loud. We could whisper because you're supposed to be on an ambush. So you've got these sound-powered phones on, a helmet, flak jacket, poncho because it's raining. We were attacked, and we took a direct hit in the bow. The rocket blast blew me down, and I was like somebody took and tied me up, and all this stuff I had on. And I was like struggling to get out of it. And anyhow, we cleared the kill zone. We headed to where the canal met the river. There was a Vietnamese outpost there. We beached our boat right there. We fired illumination. We got pumps going because we were sinking. We were on fire. Got the fires out pretty quick. We got boats with jet pumps that help us pump out. We made a temporary patch. Didn't realize we made that patch in the middle of a minefield in front of the Vietnamese outpost. But I am assuming that they were command detonated mines, not contact, because we didn't blow ourselves up. We had to get a medevac for our wounded Vietnamese trainee. He took a piece of shrapnel in his stomach, and our one gunner's mate was temporarily deaf. We had to make a slow night transit downriver, and this is not a river like straight. These things wind and wind and wind and wind, and we had to keep pulling over and get people to help us pump out because we were flooding so bad. It took 4 hours for us to make the transit back to our forward base at the mouth of the river, and then they sent people to do a temporary patch. We had to make a 2-hour sea transit in the Gulf of Siam to our division headquarters, which was a repair ship and a barracks ship, to get it repaired. Well, we didn't get repaired. They gave us another boat, told us to go right back out again. But at any rate, a week or two later, I get a letter from home, and the letter from my mother says that the pastor at home woke up on January 13th at 1 o'clock in the morning, exact same time we were attacked, felt that I was in grave danger, and prayed for me for 4 hours, the exact amount of time that it took us to get back to our base. So that didn't process with me. It was just another religious thing to me or something, I didn't have the answer for what that was all about. And really my mind was on so many other things, it couldn't process it. But years later, when I got home, and I'd say was about 6 years later, there were a number of things that were bothering me. And I would go to church, and I wasn't a church goer necessarily, but we'd go because we were having kids baptized, and so you showed up. And I got in church, and I wanted to cry, and I didn't know why. And I arranged to talk to the pastor and one evening, and I went and talked to him and said, there was a number of things on my mind, but one of them was, how could this be? How could a pastor on the other side of the world be praying for me when I'm in trouble over here? What does that mean? And he said, that's God trying to reach you and tell you how much he loves you. Your parents constantly had you in prayer, and he's trying to get a hold of you and get your attention. And he said, what you really need to do now is you need to ask him into your heart. You need to confess yourself as a sinner, and that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and that you want to ask him into your heart. And I sat there and listened to this, and and he says, I said, because there's silence. You mean right now? And he said, yeah, right now. So he led me in a sinner's prayer, and I prayed that prayer, and he got done, and he says, now I want you to read the book of John in the Bible. And I said, I don't read very good. I'm a slow reader. I don't like to read, and I had all these excuses. But I did read the book of John, and my life started to change, really. Some people talk about a Christian conversion as being this miraculous miracle, and all of a sudden you're a different person. Perhaps that's how it is, and perhaps I was. But as I read the Bible, studied the Bible, started going to church, I changed to a different person.
Thank you for sharing, Charlie. So there's a question from one of our attendees, Don. And I know you and I talked about this a bit. I think in your book, you mentioned that when you came home You saw Apocalypse Now and you were upset by the portrayal of swiftfoot sailors in Apocalypse Now. And Don's question is there any Hollywood movie that actually reflects your experience in Vietnam?
Top of my head, no. I can't. I mean, that was, first off, that was probably the only one that I recall that had anything with to show much of a riverboat. Now, that wasn't a swift boat. That was in the movie, that was a PBR, that's Patrol Boat River. And they're about 33 foot fiberglass boat. Ours was a 50-foot aluminum boat. So we were a bigger target. They were a little faster than we were. Yes, I was really upset with that because we were schooled and trained on controlling your field of fire, on what your rules of engagement are, when you can fire, when you can't fire. And it's all good logical stuff. If you take a sniper round and you're right into a village and it's or a town, and the town's got 3,000 people in it, and there's one round fired at your boat, you don't open up with all these heavy machine guns and kill dozens of people. You just don't do that. I mean, that's logic. Now, some people might say, well, they shot at you, so you shoot back. Well, that's not how it works. Now, if you're in the middle of nowhere and rockets are flying around the boat and bullets are flying through the air, you open fire with everything you got. You don't need anybody to tell you or not tell you what to do. I think I got off on a tangent from what the question was. What was the question again?
The question was whether or not there was any Hollywood movie that actually reflects your experience in Vietnam.
So this is why I say the scenes that they showed where the sailors on there were smoking pot, they were high, they were had no control of their firepower. They killed a little baby in a sampan or something because they didn't control their firepower. They were attacked by people with spears and arrows and didn't do well. It's like, this is so unreal. It was disgraceful to my training. Now, maybe I'm not going to say that every riverboat in Vietnam had good people doing the right thing. Surely there's people who do wrong things, right? But it was an insult to me, the training I had, to portray us that way in a movie.
You know, what's interesting, Charlie, is when we had our big read program in March, there was much conversation about how Hollywood has portrayed the Vietnam War, how exaggerated it is, or how even very close-minded, and how there were only very specific points of view portrayed. Yeah. So I tend to, you know, my family, for those of you who don't know, my family, my parents are Vietnamese refugees. And I think I've seen a number of Vietnam War movies. I tend to quickly avoid them, I think. At least Hollywood ones. So yeah, I haven't encountered one that's been accurate. But
you see, and a lot of the movies are movies about the Army or the Marines.
Yeah.
Can't speak to their experience. And the other thing is, I was in the Delta. The Delta is the bottom fourth of South Vietnam. Mm-hmm. Central Highlands, you've got the area up by the DMZ. Those were very different type of operating areas, and they were larger numbers of conflict, you know, where you're talking battalions and divisions and all that sort of thing. We were talking small guerrilla contact. Once in a while, they would move some NVA into certain places and try to put some serious heat on us. But for the most part, we were dealing with small numbers. Of course, there was only 6 of us on a boat, so it's a good thing it was only small numbers.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, maybe one day someone would have a more accurate portrayal in a Hollywood movie. You can only hope, right?
Yeah. It's I mean, for the most part, it seems that Hollywood movies painted a fairly negative picture of U.S. forces, and it wasn't what I saw. Now, it could have been that way, but it wasn't. As far as the Navy goes, and where I was in the Navy, that's not the way it was.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. I want to touch upon, I think it's page 237 in your book. Because I just thought it was so insightful. I don't think I mentioned this to you in our talks earlier, but you talked about fear at length.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I thought that was just so interesting because it was so, some of your thoughts are
Well,
very contemplative and philosophical. And I just thought that was very interesting, your thoughts on fear.
yeah, well, I experienced it a lot, so I got to be
Yeah. Yeah.
able to speak about it, but I'll read it. Fear comes in any level of intensity and length of duration. When trying to communicate fear, it would be clear to the reader or the listener if one could put fear on a scale with an X and a Y axis. The horizontal or X axis would be for time, and the vertical Y axis would be intensity. In fact, there should be several different words in the English language that would more accurately communicate the type of fear a person is experiencing or has experienced. But I guess that is why we have adverbs and adjectives. Fear can come instantaneously at an extreme level of intensity, or it can build slowly, or can just stay at a given level or prolonged period. Fear can be a good thing, and it can be a bad thing. Then again, maybe fear is neither good nor bad. Fear is an emotion, and I am told that emotions are neither good or bad. More accurately, it is what we do with each type of fear that determines whether fear is either good or bad. I have experienced all sorts of fear. I prefer the quick ones that I can do something about right away, no matter what the intensity level may be. An example would be being shot at and returning fire. For me, the worst kind of fear is the long duration fear. An example of long duration fear would be the monsoon storm we had ridden through back in November. The intensity level is not as awful as the duration. Fear that lasts for hours and days, which you seem to be unable to do anything about, is the worst kind of fear. It is debilitating. It sucks the life out of you. Over a prolonged time, a person becomes zombie-like. It goes on, but that's enough.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you find ways to cope with your fear through the time you were in Vietnam?
Um, you harden and you numb. You get numb and hard and calloused. And that's people talk about adjustment coming home. There's a number of things that you have to adjust to, and one of them is hopefully that you start to get in touch with your emotions more and not be as numb and calloused. I feel like it took about a year for me to adapt. I hated civilians because civilians don't react. I was taught to react. When something happens, you act. And civilians would see somebody fall down and just look at them, or see somebody hurt, and just so many of them are just gawk. It's like, it drove me crazy. But eventually I calmed down about that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with that, Charlie. I know it can be hard, but I think it's so valuable too.
We've got through this better than I thought we would so far.
I know everyone, Charlie and I were basically saying that we'd probably be a lot of tears tonight. So
yeah, we talked last week, and it was very emotional last week.
Yeah. And I think sometimes it's good. It's good to let out your emotions.
Yeah.
But thank you for sharing that, because I just thought that was so insightful, your passage. And it took you a while, I'm sure, to adjust coming home. What was it like coming home?
One of the things I desperately wanted was for somebody to understand what I've been through. And I would say I spent a year of my weekends and nights in bars, hoping I'd find somebody I could explain it to and they would understand. And even if I talked to other Vietnam veterans, generally there were guys who were in the Army that were stationed in a whole different area, and they had no concept of what we did. So after about a year, I just said, nobody's going to understand, so just get on with life, get over it, and move on. But now,
yeah. Did you ever find a bigger network of people over time, Charlie, to talk to?
I belong to some different, social groups or whatever, Vietnam veterans and that sort of thing. And we have some common ground, that we can share. But it's, I think writing the book helped process a lot of it, maybe that I didn't completely process before.
Yeah, I'd imagine so.
Mhm.
That's very good. There's also another passage that I thought was very insightful that I would love for you to share. And it's page 287, actually, about what you've observed as you traveled through Vietnam.
Oh, okay. As I moved through around Vietnam, I haven't been all over Vietnam, but as far as the Delta area goes, I've covered a good deal of the Delta. By the way, I circumnavigated the Delta at one, not all on one trip, but as all the different places they sent us to, up and down different rivers and out on the coast. And I have circumnavigated the entire Delta, but anyhow. I find that people sometimes have a hard time describing what this war is like and have all different outlooks on this war. I think I know what that reason is now, because everywhere you go is a different situation, different logistical setup, a different way of fighting the war. Every place I've been so far is different from the other place. The logistics were different, what our job was different, everything was different. People's outlook were different, and I think this is one of the big reasons why you can talk to one guy that was in Vietnam, and he'll say it was hell. He was getting shot at all the time. And another guy will tell you he never got shot at once. Another guy will say the NVA are a big threat. And another guy will say the VC are a big threat. And I think this is what the story is. It's just that everywhere you go is different and affects people's outlook on this war differently. If you spend all your time in Vietnam down at Sea Float, that was a notorious floating base in the very, very southern tip of Khao Mau, which basically it had been a VC stronghold. Nobody had attempted to do anything with it. The Navy towed barges in there and set up shop in the middle of the river and started running operations from there in the middle of VC held territory. So anyhow, if you spend all your time in Vietnam down there at Sea Float, you'd say this is the most backwards, worthless hunk of land. There's just VC running all over, and it's really a bad place. You spend all your time in Ha Tien, being right on the Cambodian border, you'd have a different sort of outlook. If you spent all your time here in Chao Duc, where it's almost entirely peaceful, you'd have another outlook. You would say this war is won. You go to Cat Lo, where there's Australian bases and Korean bases and US bases and Vietnamese bases and all kinds of bases. Just military power all over. You'd say it's so populated, so many troops all around it. The VC can't do much of anything anyhow, just make a little harassment every now and then. So anywhere you go, it's different. The people look different in some ways. That's why everybody has a different outlook on this war, I think.
That's so true. Thank you so much, Charlie.
The other perspective,
yeah.
when you talk about different attitudes about the war, I think you also, the attitudes of the American people, not necessarily veterans, but the American people, because there was so much anti-war protest and there were so many people against the war. And one of the things I write in the book, and I wrote it because I believe it, if you were there and you saw the people and you saw some of the horrible things that the Viet Cong did to them, you'd know we needed to be there, that we should be there. It was the right thing to do. Am I my brother's keeper? If you're a father and a mother, and every night you hear the death toll on the news of how many people got killed in Vietnam today, and your son's going to go to Vietnam, you've got another attitude about the war. You don't want that to happen. I understand that. I understand both sides of that. So there was a very passionate subject with so many people. It was very political. My feelings are, I invested a year of my life there. We invested over 58,000 lives there. Millions of GIs spent time there. We negotiated a peace treaty in what, 1972, 73, something like that, 73. All sides made agreements. We made promises to the South Vietnamese people. We left, but we made promises that if the treaty was broken, we would step back in and help. Nixon got booted out because of what he did. A new Congress came in, new president took place, and our people were so, a lot of the politicians that got voted into the 94th Congress ran on an anti-war type thing because they thought they'd get votes on it. Our Congress voted not to supply any more supplies to the South Vietnamese. They voted not to militarily intervene and help them. The North Vietnamese broke almost every term of that treaty, and build up. China and Russia helped them and helped them and helped them while we stopped helping the South Vietnamese, and they invaded and took over because we, in my opinion, we turned our back on somebody we made a promise to. Now I understand why politically that happened, but it doesn't sit well with me. Promise is a promise.
Charlie, we have a couple more questions that are actually related.
Okay.
Yeah, in terms of whether or not you have any desire to return to Vietnam as a tourist from Sandy. And Home has a question. Many Vietnam vets felt the need to go back to visit old battlefields or just revisit the country. Do you share the same feelings? Have you been back? If yes, do you have any impressions of comparing now versus then?
No, I've never had the desire to go back. I've had some curiosity, which I think is what fuels them wanting to go back, is curiosity. Somewhere in my research for the book, I was doing Google Earth, and Ha Tien, which was, like I say, that little forward base that we operated from, you go there now, it's a resort. And the funny thing is, in my book, I write, wow, if there wasn't a war here, this could be a beautiful resort area. There's, gorgeous this. And that's now a resort. And a couple miles away over in Cambodia, there's a casinos, and it's unbelievable. Dung Island is an island, aptly named Dung Island, but anyhow, it's an island in the middle of the Bossack River in the Delta. It was a VC stronghold. And every time we would ride in between that island and the one river bank on the other side, we usually ran into enemy contact. Of course, a lot of times it was because we were doing PSYOPs. PSYOPs is psychological warfare. And what we had was these giant loudspeakers on the boat. And we play this pre-recorded tape in Vietnamese that told the Viet Cong to surrender, come over to our side, and we'll, you'll have regular meals, and we will, all be forgiven, and we'll provide you with a home and everything else. And usually they didn't like that, and they shot at us for that. But anyhow, where was I going with this? Dung Island was remote. I mean, it was just this rural remote thing. Google Earth, I go on there, it's got roads and schools and movie theaters. Like, what? So anyhow, so that I understand some of the curiosity. But I've never really had an interest to go back.
Yeah. We have a lovely note from Carol in the chat. I don't know if you can see it, Charlie. But she writes, "Thank you for your service. I was a teenager during the Vietnam War. I always felt conflict, which labels that period in history as very disturbing. I watched the evening news with my parents where they staged two figures, one American and one VC. The statistics of deaths were always higher for the VC, but I could not figure out why we were not winning. As time passes, the truth about this period is brought to the surface by historians. I visit the Vietnam Memorial a number of times, and that period rushes through me." That's what she writes.
Well, first off, there's a popular expression with Vietnam veterans nowadays. We were winning when I left.
Wow.
We had pacified a great amount of the Delta when I left. It was accomplished. I suspect there were, listen, we didn't lose that war. And one thing I hate to say is I hate hearing people say, well, we lost the war. We didn't lose the war. We walked away from it. We refused to help the South Vietnamese. We trained them, we gave them all kind of stuff, and then we walked away. We didn't lose that war. We walked away from it. our orders were to come home. So, I'm sorry, what was her question again? I got wound up.
No, she just had a comment, and
But I don't think we weren't losing the war. We were not losing the war. We were making headway. We had, when Nixon started bombing North Vietnam, that's what brought them to the peace table. They would have never came to the peace table if we hadn't done that. And even their own people since then, there have been generals from the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, who have stated that they were ready for collapse. We had just about bombed them down to giving up, but they went to the peace table. We made a deal that we didn't hold them to, and we walked away. And that's the truth. That's what, if you want to read a good book, there's a book called American Amnesia. It'll tell you detail by detail how that went down.
if anyone has any further questions for Charlie, we are getting up to our hour here, Charlie.
Okay.
So
I got a little wound up. I apologize if I got a little wound up.
it's okay. It's okay. It was a very controversial and tumultuous time period.
Right.
So
When I have tomorrow I'll be doing a presentation over at the Pennington Presbyterian Church. That's actually, this morning I actually trimmed it. It was 53 minutes long, which was too long. I trimmed it down some. But when I do the full presentation, I talk about everything the Navy did before the war actually started and even after. That they were there before the war and after the war. We did so many things that people never hear about. There's so many facets to the Navy and its service. I try in that talk to give honor to everything the Navy did.
and what time is that, Charlie, at the Pennington
That is
Presbyterian Church?
the talk is at 1 o'clock tomorrow. They have a group called the Brown Bag Lunch Group, and everybody brings their own lunch, and that's
Yes.
30. But the talk is at 1.
Yes, and other people are welcome, Charlie, to
Yeah,
stop by too.
they kind of indicated that they would sort of want to keep it for the local people, which I mean, that would make sense. I mean, I'm going to come from way far away for lunch tomorrow, but and that goes, I have, like I said, there's a PowerPoint that goes with that, and my talk knits right into what I'm showing with the PowerPoint. But I did have to cut it back. I tried to cover too many bases.
Yes, and your book, for those of you who haven't read it, it's Through the Water and Through the Fire. Through the Water and the Fire.
Can I talk about the title a minute?
Yeah, tell us
Okay.
about the title.
I struggled for a long time with a title. Like, what do I call this? I had all these possible titles. And the strange thing is, on my mantle, on the fireplace in my bedroom, I have a quote from the book of Isaiah in the Bible. And it says, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you go through the fire, you will not be burnt. You will not be set ablaze, because I am the Lord your God, your Savior. And that's where through the fire comes through, because he was with me through the water and through the fire. So
That's lovely.
350 pages, about 100 color photos, and it talks about a lot of things. Even after the war, as I told you, our church sponsored a Vietnamese family and got them a great success story. Great thing that with that, I got involved in the 2004 election with the Swiftboat Veterans for Truth, and a lot of people, that was controversial. Anyhow, there's a lot there.
Well, thank you so much, Charlie, for everything, for joining us tonight. And again, for Pennington attendees, Charlie, if you want to meet Charlie in person, he'll be at the Pennington Presbyterian Church tomorrow for the Brown Bag Group, doing his talk. And again, Charlie, just thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your story. And just thank you for your service.
Well, thank you for having me and allowing me to blow off a little steam too.
Yeah, of course, of course. I think we have a couple of more questions or comments. Let's see. Just a comment, I learned a lot this evening. I always enjoy listening to folks who had real experiences, not Hollywood. Well done. Thank you so much, Kathleen. So good night, everyone, and have a lovely weekend. Bye-bye.
Good night.